Good morning. You're listening to Retake Our Democracy, a 30-minute weekly show that airs at 8:30 a.m. each Saturday morning on KSFR 101.1 FM, your Santa Fe public radio station. And I'm Paul Gibson, the host of Retake Our Democracy. Today we will be talking with Sam Hitt, a friend and forest activist from Santa Fe. We will be talking about the recent firestorms in New Mexico, the U.S. Forest Service's failed efforts to prevent these fires, and how best to approach prevention of forest fire catastrophes in the future. We'll get to Sam in just a minute, but first a few short announcements. Last week, I spoke with Alicia Edwards, the Grant County Commissioner and chairperson of the board of the Gila Regional Hospital, a position she assumed when Grant County assume management of the financially failing hospital. Given our recent focus on healthcare systems and the challenges faced by rural New Mexico hospitals, we thought Commissioner Edwards would be a timely guest, and boy, were we right. It was a most informative interview. I want to remind you that if you're driving around town and miss any of today's show, you can watch the full YouTube recording of this show and any prior interview by going to retakeourdemocracy.org, clicking on the Retake on the Radio button on the right side of the homepage, and you'll find YouTube recordings of all of our previous shows listed in chronological order, so you can binge watch Retake radio shows for free. You could do it all weekend long. We have Zoominars also planned for October. Zoominars are our way of doing basically webinars on Zoom and broadcasting them statewide. And we had one scheduled for this past week, but due to some illnesses, we had to postpone the Zoominar we had planned for Public Bank, and that will be rescheduled for October, along with a Zoominar on guaranteed basic income pilot projects in New Mexico and another on public power in New Mexico. So go to retakeourdemocracy.org, click on Actions and Events in the homepage banner, and you will land on a page with more info and links to register for these Zoominars. You must register to attend. Before we get started, I want to acknowledge that we are conducting this show on stolen Tewa land, and I want to thank our Tewa neighbors for being such good stewards of the land. We could learn much from them, from their custodial caring for the land, water, air, and forest. Okay. Let's meet Sam Hitt and find out more about what we can do to prevent forest fires in the face of climate change and drought. Welcome, Sam.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. Thanks for having me.
That's always a pleasure. We've had you on before. So I always like to let our guests introduce themselves. So how about if you take a minute to just tell us who you are and how you wound up becoming a forest activist?
Yeah, so I first came to Santa Fe, Paul, in 1969. I drove up the Ski Basin Road to as far as Black Canyon. That's where the pavement ended, and that's where my Ford Fairline basically stopped running. So I've been hiking the Black Canyon area for quite a few decades. In 1980, I became quite concerned over the pesticide spraying on the Santa Fe National Forest. So we worked on that with a few other people. Gary Schroed up in Taos was the main guy. And we basically stopped that program. They were spraying about 100,000 acres a year with an insecticide to control a forest insect, the western spruce budworm. By 1987, the program had ended. Although we had lost in court, the newspaper thought we were crazy. But the Girl Scouts up in Angel Fire blockaded the runway in the spring of 1987, preventing the spray planes from taking off. And pretty soon the program disappeared. I founded what is now Wild Earth Guardians. Back then it was called Forest Guardians in 1989, basically to protect the old growth ancient forests of the Southwest. And now I head up a nonprofit group, the Santa Fe Forest Coalition.
Okay, so you've been active. Can we get some of those Girl Scouts back? And I think we need them.
You know, it was, yeah, they have great credibility, I can tell you that. Yeah.
Well, let's start digging into the recent Hermit's Peak Calf Canyon fire that devastated so much of northeast New Mexico and continues its damage via floods and rain-caused erosion. Tell us your view of how these fires started.
Well, you got to go inside the Forest Service bureaucracy. They're driven like any large organization by incentives. So the forest managers advance their careers by meeting targets, and that means acres cut and acres burned. At the national level, budgets are increased for the Forest Service as a whole when the targets are met. So they have a yearly budget cycle. So that's a big part of why Congress allocates money to the Forest Service. So this basically creates a huge incentive to take risk. The people who run the intentional burning program were really felt hemmed in by the COVID shutdown and really were wanting to get out in the field and start some fires. So I worked with local residents in Las Vegas over a decade ago that authorized these intentional burns. So you notice I call them intentional burns and not prescribed burns or prescribed fires. That's the old term, and I think is more accurate. Prescribed has sort of a medical connotation. There's sort of a doctor behind the scenes, and I think it's totally inappropriate. So working with those folks in Las Vegas, we managed to stop old growth logging in the roadless areas near Elk Mountain. But eventually the Forest Service got approved plans to clear about 5,000 acres in the Gallinas Canyon. So as your listeners probably know, that's the watershed for the city of Las Vegas. Those 5,000 acres that were cleared, and you notice I used the word cleared and not thinned. I think it's, again, a more accurate term since more than 90% of the trees are cut down. So it was cleared and burned in the fire that started from that intentional burn to the east, roared through those 5,000 acres within the first day or two. So I know that goes contrary to a lot of the Forest Service propaganda about how intentional clearing and burning will reduce fuels and therefore mitigate fire behavior. In fact, it often doesn't do that. Sometimes it does, but when you have intense climate-driven fires like we see more often these days, with incredible winds and intense dry conditions, nothing will stop them. In fact, when they hit those patches of cleared land, the fires move faster because the fine fuels on the forest floor, the shrubs, the grasses, the small trees dry out in the sunlight. The wind speed is increased because the trees are removed, and the fire races through those areas. So
it was an intentional burn that started the
yes,
permits.
that's exactly right. So I was, there's been a lot of reporting on the big mistakes they made there, and of course I was trying to give the background of why they did that, why they took those risks. And again, it's these institutional incentives. Their careers are advanced, and the agency as a whole benefits from meeting these targets. So there's incentive to take risk. Yeah.
Okay, so I read recently that there were a large number of ranchers, farmers, and residents in San Miguel and Mora County who begged the Forest Service not to conduct the prescribed burn because of the imminent weather forecast. I guess there were 40 to 60 mile an hour hot winds predicted for the day they did that. And those concerns were ignored. What's the history of communication and planning collaboration between the feds and the state and local residents?
Well, the Forest Service is viewed as a colonizing army by most folks in northern New Mexico. And there's a lot of parallels to really indicate that that's true. They are the experts. They tell people what's going to happen, why they're doing certain things, and they simply don't listen. They don't listen to cautious advice. They don't listen to long historical information. And in fact, information from independent scientists and informed citizens is just often ignored. And as I've experienced over the years, advocates are attacked personally, personal attacks. So although it's required by law, they're often too rushed to take time to listen. They don't feel a need to listen. So instead, the Forest Service over the years, and I've watched it grow, funds these incredible propaganda campaigns. They work with nonprofit groups, funding them to run these campaigns, and basically their message is consistent with what the timber industry desires. Here in New Mexico, it really is just an incredible waste of money. They're spending taxpayer dollars to make tree cutting profitable for the timber industry. They're trying to create incentives for the industry to set up shop in various places here. Instead, they could be helping homeowners in rural communities harden their homes against wildfire and create defensible space that I'm sure we'll talk more about here in the future.
Yeah, I got some questions for that about that later on. So the area burned in Hermit's Peak and Calf Canyon are among the poorest in our state. I'm told that the fire service would rather use its funds to prevent future fires rather than provide substantial assistance to those who were impacted by the fire. Can you comment on this? And should this be an either or should the feds do both? And do we even want their help in the future?
It's interesting that you use the term fire service because that's what the Forest Service is becoming. Over half their budget now goes into firefighting, fire-related activities. They're just consumed by the whole fire issue. So first, as a result of this tragedy with the Hermit's Peak Calf Canyon fires, we really need a new federal fire policy that redirects money from clearing and burning forests in remote areas and provides low interest loans and grants for impoverished communities like in Moore County so they can survive wildfires. So currently, less than 3% of the literally billions of dollars that have been allocated through the infrastructure bills and other allocations for fire prevention, I mean, billions of dollars, less than 3% goes to local residents to take fire-wise actions around their homes. In fact, over 1,000 structures didn't have to burn in the Hermit's Peak Calf Canyon fires. Good science shows that sensible measures to harden homes, create defensible space around structures, saves homes from even the hottest wildfire. Good hard science to show that. Dr. Jack Cohen spent his career doing that science, and he's a highly respected researcher. And so second, we need to get the Forest Service out of the logging business. So a lot of people don't realize that the Forest Service sells our trees and keeps the money. And these are a result of these antiquated laws passed back in the 1930s, like the Knudsen-Vandenberg Act. And then third, I believe we need a new service, not a fire service, not a forest service, but a climate service that really protects public forests to mitigate the impacts of the climate crisis. And so that means keeping trees standing, not cutting them down, protecting soils, and in particular, closing the vast network of logging roads that bleed sediment into streams and provide access for people to start fires. So, those are both short-term and long-term things we need to do, Paul.
Okay, so I take it from what we've said so far that you clearly don't think intentional burns are a good idea, especially when there's 40 to 60 mile an hour hot winds in the forecast. But I'm also hearing you say that even in the best of circumstances, it's just a shill for the logging industry and not really a viable fire prevention strategy.
Well, Paul, I thought long and hard about this, and quite frankly, years ago, I was an advocate for intentional burning. It seemed like a reasonable way to deal with our fire adapted forests, but lately I have come around to see its problems. So, some of the biggest problems are that it's ineffective, and it releases vast quantities of carbon into the atmosphere. So the problem is that it's a intentional burning that, of course, goes with the clearing. So the vegetation is cleared first, and then it's burned, either in piles or what they call broadcast burning. These cleared areas, the so-called fine fuels, the grasses, the shrubs, the small trees, rapidly grow as these areas are opened up, and this is the fuel. These are the fine fuels that where fires start and are carried. So this clearing and burning is a short-term, time-sensitive thing. It lasts about a decade. So if they don't get there in a decade or so, it's going to create more fire hazard than originally. So
Can you clarify that? What do you mean if they don't get, what do they have to do within a decade?
so it's that let's say a patch of forest is cleared of fuels.
Okay.
That will be effective in stopping a fire for about a decade until the fine fuels grow and make the past treatments ineffective.
Okay.
So the probability of a wildfire hitting a patch that has been cleared within a decade is infinitesimally small, less than 1%. Um, and that's why, as a policy, when you're talking about entire national forest or an entire ecoregion region like the Southern Rockies, it's an ineffective policy. Now, scientists have been pointing this out for, oh my goodness, over 30 years. You can see this in the literature, but the message has not gotten home to policymakers. So, for that reason alone, the ineffectiveness of intentional burning, it just makes it just creates lots of questions. And of course, the other thing that most people are concerned about are the health impacts of smoke. So the Forest Service and the timber industry like to say that, oh, well, we clear land and we burn, and so we have less smoke from wildfire. No, no. What we do is we have cumulative increase in smoke. So we have both the smoke from the intentional burning and the smoke from the wildfires. So it's increasing the overall exposure of people to smoke. And it's cumulative because we're surrounded by fine particulate air pollution, even in Santa Fe. And when those fine particulates get in the lungs, they cause just a host of adverse health outcomes. So that's another major reason to keep intentional burning away from people's lungs.
Okay. I got to take a quick break here, Sam. So I got to tell people that we're listening to Retake Our Democracy on KSFR. And KSFR is more important than ever, offering timely news and alerts and a wide range of programming to keep you informed and sane in these very challenging times in an era replete with misinformation and disinformation on social media and the mainstream media. Getting straight information from KSFR is so important. And so when you get done listening to the show, how about if you go to ksfr.org and click on the donate button and toss some 20, 30 bucks and look at it as your ticket for admission to some very good programming. Thank you, KSFR. And on behalf of KSFR, I thank our listeners for their support. So, Sam, let's get back into the discussion. Looking back decades, how has our approach to forest fire containment created the tinderbox condition of most of our forests? How was this tinderbox condition created? And given the realities of drought and climate change, are these fires inevitable, these forest firestorms?
Well, Paul, you got to step back a little and look at the Southwest as a whole. So we're in a continental climate, far removed from the ocean. And not only that, it's an extreme continental climate. So we know that we have decades long droughts, the kind of droughts that wiped out the Anasazi, for example. And then that's followed by relatively wet conditions. So trees germinate and grow in the dense forests during the wet times. When it dries out, they burn. That's the story of our forests in the Southwest. We're not going to change that through these sort of hubristic fuel management plans that are cooked up by the politicians and the agencies. We're talking millions of acres here, and we're already spending billions of dollars and not getting anywhere. So basically, Paul, we're going to have to live with the climate that we got. Of course, it's getting more extreme because of the pollution of the atmosphere. That's where we have to focus our efforts, get the greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere. And of course, that means keeping the fossil fuels in the ground. So, it's that's basically the long and short story, Paul.
So, give us the longer story of what the historic approach to fire management has been by the U.S. Forest Service and the nation, and how that has contributed to creating these tinderboxes.
Well, the Forest Service line is simply disconnected from the story of our forests here in the Southwest. So they basically say, oh, we suppress fires starting back in the 1920s or so, and that created dense forests. And now we got to go in and create less dense forests. No, that those forests that grew dense during that time was because we're in a very wet period. And then as it's dried out, those dense forests are burning. So the Forest Service would like to take responsibility for an error they didn't create or for conditions they didn't create. And it's kind of a redemption story. It sort of have Christian sort of echoes to it, but it's crazy. It's disconnected from ecological reality. Again, climate determines forest conditions. Climate determines the type of fires we have, and it's not a tinderbox that management has created.
So you can correct me on this, but I was under the impression, and I thought I got this from you, that decades of just basically saying any forest fire is bad, we got to go in there and stop it right away and put it out, that intervened in Mother Nature's natural cycle that you talked about, from going from wet to dry and fire, and then the fire naturally thins out the forest. But if you continually intervene, then it gets thick and creates these possible firestorm conditions. Is that incorrect then?
Yeah, that is incorrect, Paul. Unfortunately. I mean, just imagine, so the Santa Fe National Forest is about 1.5 million acres. The Carson National Forest, a little bit bigger than that. The Southern Rockies ecosystem that we are in the very southern portion of in northern New Mexico here extends all the way through Colorado, up to northeastern Utah, and up into southern Wyoming, hundreds of millions of acres. So people going around with mules and pickaxes and Pulaskis putting out lightning-caused fires, and that has influenced an entire ecosystem. It just doesn't make sense. So even after World War II, when more technology was applied to suppression of fires with tankers and motor vehicles that got into remote areas, still it was not nearly uh, effective in suppressing fire. So again, it was a wet period, and there are some great graphics that I can show that have been published widely that show that it's not Forest Service suppression of fires that have created dense forests or so-called tinderbox conditions, but it's the climate. And
Okay.
in the Southwest, we have an extreme climate. And the bottom line, we got to learn how to live with where we live.
Well, Sam, I want to thank you for being with us today on the radio show. We're going to continue this discussion for our Retake on the Radio YouTube recording, but we'll be back next week with another show. And in the meantime, please stay safe and healthy, and above all, stay active. It's the only way we fix this mess. Good day. Have a good Saturday. So we're back with Sam Hitt, and we're going to continue our discussion about the mismanagement of our forests and our hubristic efforts to try and control everything. Looking back over time, is it your view that if we had just been more laissez-faire in our approach to fires and let Mother Nature manage themselves, we wouldn't have these tinderbox conditions today, or is it all about climate?
Well, I guess as background, we need to look at the fire regimes in our various types of forests. So the high elevation forests, like in the Pecos Wilderness or up in Santa Fe Baldy or the ski area, those are spruce fir forests. They burn very infrequently, but very hot. So like once every 100 years, there'll be huge fires there that will basically kill every tree over thousands of acres. And then you have the pinon juniper woodlands that, of course, that is around town. That also burns very infrequently. But when it does burn, it burns quite hot. And then in between, you have the ponderosa pine and what they call the dry mixed conifer forests, Douglas fir, white fir, aspen, etc. And those burn with a mixed severity fire. So there'll be intensive fire patches, medium fire patches, and low intensity fire patches. So that, so the each ecosystem is adapted to its fire regime. Now, the conflict here is that the Forest Service has discussed the dry mixed conifer and ponderosa pine forest. So that's about maybe 30% of the Santa Fe National Forest. They characterize that as a low intensity fire regime. So a fire would burn through there, according to their calculations, every 5 to 7 years. That's quite frequent. They're simply wrong about that. It's based on fire scar data that is selective and incomplete. When you take a more comprehensive view of the data, you see that it's a mixed severity fire regime, and the fire return interval, or the time between fires, is more like 70, 50, 60, 70 years, depending on the aspect and slope. So if you're trying to restore forests and you think that the fire return interval is only 5 to 7 years, you're going to be convinced that you'd have to do a lot more manipulation. Um, and that is what leads to a lot of our problems. If that
So
makes sense.
is that I take it there's a kind of continuum of perspectives from mega management to let nature have its manage itself. And can you just kind of describe the that continuum, like from most, is it the fire service that has the most aggressive perspective on managing forest? And are there other positions that are more moderate?
Well, so it it comes down to when fires should be suppressed. Again, our forests are adapted to fires, are shaped by fires, have evolved with fires. So when a fire starts, should be suppressed. We're talking about lightning caused fire. So it depends on where it starts, as I described earlier. Let's say it starts in the high elevation wilderness areas in the spruce fir. Um, Many people, many ecologists, and many informed wildlife biologists say let it burn. That's going to create beneficial habitat, and that's also characteristic of a natural fire regime for that ecosystem. Um,
Yeah, I
and
guess before man, they didn't have firefighters, did they?
that's right. That's right. And which is interesting. That gets into the cultural burning issue. The Forest Service likes to hide behind this issue that or this belief that Native Americans basically burned all the forests and managed the forest through fire. Well, that's just simply not true. The population of the Rocky Mountains, all the way from Mexico to Canada, was about the population of Missoula, Montana. So that number of people, it was impossible that they could manage fire through that vast landscape. Most fire was a result of lightning strikes, as was then and as is the case today. We have some of the highest number of lightning strikes in the world here in New Mexico. So I kind of forgot where we were going with this, Paul. It was
Is a continuum of perspectives
yeah,
on how to
yeah,
manage or not manage.
yeah. So, but let's say we have a lightning started fire close to town in the dry mixed conifer, the ponderosa pine forest, and you might want to suppress that fire because there are valuable structures that are at risk. So that involves a fire plan, which unfortunately the Santa Fe National Forest does not have. So that would have trigger points that would say, should we let the fire burn or should we suppress the fire? Those are the key decision points. A lot of national forests do, like the Gila National Forest has a good fire plan. So basically, it depends on where the fire starts, what type of ecosystem it is in, and you know, these kind of decisions are part of living with fire.
Okay. Um, so I assume there are things we can do to try and prevent future fires of the scale we're experiencing, and that would not include more intentional burns. How do we prevent or at least limit the number and severity of future firestorms, or can we?
Well, uh, I'm not sure we can, and I'm not sure we should. So this gets to another issue that's not often discussed is the beneficial role of fire, even high intensity fires, to create habitat. So the charcoal forests, as we call them, or the early successional post-fire forests, are the second most diverse ecosystem on the national forest here in northern New Mexico. The first is the old growth forest, but you have uh, just a tremendous outpouring of um, animals and plants that come in to those those post-fire environments. So it's kind of like the mythological phoenix that arises from the fire. So you have aspens, oaks, and trees and shrubs that sprout from the roots, even in the most severely burned areas. Of course, the wildflowers and grasses cover the soil. Bees, butterflies, beetles fill the air. The pocket gophers and salamanders emerge from their burrows. And as of course the hunters know, that there's tremendous increases in elk and deer populations. The most interesting species that I think occupies our post-fire forests is the so-called three-toed woodpecker. So they arrive from far distant areas to nest in the charred trees and to feed on these wood-boring beetles. There's about 6 different species that fly from literally miles away. They hone in on the fire's heat and smoke and bore into those standing charcoal trees. So, basically it's fires of all kinds and intensities renew forests by recycling nutrients and creating habitat.
Well, it sounds like a kind of natural cycle there.
Yeah, yeah. It's the forests know how to heal themselves. It doesn't take the doctor to prescribe this and that and talking about forest health. The forest knows what health means and knows how to achieve it.
Okay. So you had mentioned earlier on that the fire service would be far better served by helping local communities near fires to protect themselves against those fires. And I had just read something, I didn't read it very carefully or all of it, but it was something to the effect that, the concept of creating a defensible space and 30 feet from your house to wood piles or trees is a very good strategy for protecting your home. It's not going to protect your surroundings, of course, but I had read that is not effective in these kind of firestorm things because the embers will fly right past your defensible space. But I heard you saying that there are ways to create that. So how can you create a protected area around your house?
I think, Paul, unfortunately, you were misinformed. Again, the research is quite clear that even the most high intensity fires, when the air is filled with embers that are flying past in 40, 50 mile an hour winds, if the home is hardened, it doesn't have a wood shake roof and the attic vents are sealed up and the wood piles are moved away from the front door, et cetera, that home is going to survive those high intensity fires. If you look at the fires, like for example in Los Alamos in 2001, so over 400 homes burned, and you go in that neighborhood and you see the charcoal remains of the homes, but the trees around the homes were unaffected, lived right through the fire. That indicates that it wasn't the forest, the big high intensity fire that moved through there. It was a home caught fire because they hadn't taken those fire-wise precautions. And the neighboring home caught fire, and then suddenly the whole neighborhood's burned down. So again, it's really clear that taking those, the science is really clear that taking those fire-wise precautions is effective and needs to be done. Now, it's expensive to do, let's be honest. So in Mora County, very few people had taken those precautions. We need low interest loans and grants in some cases so they can get their structures up to speed. Now, there's a good example from California around South Lake Tahoe, a fairly wealthy community. The people there had taken those fire-wise precautions. They had spent money to harden their homes, clear vegetation around their windows and things, And when the Calder fire burned through, almost no homes were lost. I think one in the entire community was lost. But that same fire that went through the town of Grizzly, up in just a few a few miles away, up in the foothills, burned to the ground because it was not a high income community, and not many people could afford to create those defensible spaces or harden their homes. So there's good science. Even in the most high intensity fires, structures survive if these simple measures are taken.
Okay, so we spoke earlier, and so you know that the Water and Natural Resources Interim Committee is meeting in Espanola on Thursday, the 29th, and prescribed burns is on the agenda. The panel is comprised of Linda McCarthy, State Forester, Forestry Division for EMNRD, Environment and Minerals and Natural Resources Department, Dana Skelly, the Deputy Fire Director for the United States Forest Service, United States Department of Agriculture, and Gwen Kolb, the State Direct Coordinator for Partners for Fish and Wildlife. And then finally, Eitan Krasilovsky, the Deputy Director of the Fire Service, United States Department of the Interior. What would you expect from those folks at the panel?
Well, I'm not going to expect much. They're just going to speak to the choir and continue what they've been doing now for many decades. What those policymakers need to hear is from independent scientists. Over 200 of those scientists recently wrote a letter to Congress asking that the environmental laws be strengthened and not weakened, as the Congress was about to do. We also need to hear from members of the medical community about the impacts of smoke from intentional burns, as I mentioned earlier. It's just these excluded voices are the reason we have this ineffective fire policy, and we need to open up the aperture, if you will, and hear a broad range of opinions so we can get a sensible policy enacted and not continue with something that obviously does not work.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Sam, for so clearly laying out the issues, and I hope our listeners now have a better understanding of the challenges we face in stewarding our forests instead of managing them. And I hope listeners will go to our website at retakeourdemocracy.org and click on Actions and Events in the homepage banner. On that page, you will find a link to all of our action alerts. And our most recent action alert had information about the time and date. It's the 29th, but the time and location in Espanola for the hearing, and I hope to see you there. And I'll be back next week with a new show. Stay tuned and stay active. And thank you again, Sam, very much.
Thank you.